Tensions are high and masks are slipping in the wake of the Trump administration suffering multiple back-to-back-to-back high-profile legal defeats. Trump, J.D. Vance, and other MAGA Republicans are openly suggesting that Republicans should simply ignore the courts when it's convenient for them. We stand poised on the precipice of a true and unprecedented constitutional crisis. And in response to all this, CNN's resident MAGA stooge, Scott Jennings, the smuggest, most insufferable conservative in mainstream media, including on Fox, had a full-blown meltdown on a recent CNN panel alongside former Republican Governor Chris Sununu as they confronted the hypocrisy of their position and advocated for total Trump control of the government. This is totally unhinged. But before we unpack all that, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert bells before you go. All right, friends, we're going to do something unusual here, which is we're going to play an entire segment, 9 minutes long, almost 10 minutes long, but it's worth every second, and you need the full context. Here is CNN MAGA stooge Scott Jennings openly advocating for Trump dominance over not only the executive, not only the legislature, but even the judiciary. Trump authoritarian government.
But we do know that judges do get to say whether the executive is complying with the law or not. That's been the case for decades, hundreds of years.
Well, I think there's a difference between saying whether you're complying with the law and then you have these individual district court judges setting effectively broad federal policy that is specifically reserved for the president of the United States. I think we do have a constitutional crisis, and it's being caused by these judges. They're not here to tell us. They're not here to tell us how to spend the money. They're not here to set broad federal policy. That is the president's job as elected by the people. These judges are supposed to be settling discrete, specific matters, not policy setting. I think Vance is right. I think Trump has a point. And these judges want nothing more to continue the lawfare against
I don't
Trump.
think anybody's...
So, again, to be clear, that's Scott Jennings saying that Trump and J.D. Vance are correct that judges should not be allowed to restrain or constrain executive overreach by Donald Trump. That's something that apparently only applies to Democrats. When a Democrat's in the White House, then district judges, lowly district federal judges, are free to slap down Democratic policy left, right, and center on a local basis, on a discrete basis, on a nationwide basis. That's okay. But how dare you, Mr. Federal Judge, try to restrain a Republican president?
Going to be surprised to hear that you think Trump is
they're
right.
doing this on
However,
purpose.
Just on a real important technical point here, one of the main disputes is whether the executive branch can just decide not to spend money that another co-equal branch has said ought to be spent. So it's not just about forcing the federal government to spend money. It's saying Congress said you need to spend this money this way, and the executive branch saying, no, I don't feel like it, and the courts say you have to
Well, my answer to that simply is, it is the executive branch's job to figure out how to spend money once it is appropriated by Congress. And sometimes they spend money that's not been appropriated. But the correct political control is between the executive and the Congress,
I want to return to that because that is all.
Again, when a Republican's in power, that's Scott's posture. Like, the courts just need to butt out. The courts shouldn't be intervening. Again, we don't even have to hypothesize. He's been on the record advocating for judges under the Biden administration to slap down the Biden administration's policies on a whole host of issues. He was enthusiastic about judicial checks and balances then. I'll also point out, just again, Abby Phillip, the host here, she does a really good job. She becomes increasingly fed up as Scott becomes increasingly deranged. You'll see it here. But it's important to remember we don't have three co-equal branches. That's a canard. The word co-equal is never used in the Constitution. We have three coordinate branches. The legislature was always envisioned by the founding fathers, right or wrong, I would argue right, to be the dominant branch, the final hand on top over the president and the Supreme Court. Just pointing that out.
Also a major legal question.
Do you really think that J.D. Vance's tweet is only about these district judges?
I think
this is a slippery slope because they're going to move on to what the next ruling is. They're setting the stage so that they can say that the executive branch has control now over the judicial branch. They're setting the stage.
No,
and for people who think that President Trump has not planned all of this, he pushes the envelope constantly. There was January 6th. He has a myriad of people out there that would support the executive branch being able to rule over the judicial branch because there have been no repercussions. And when there are not consequences and when there are not repercussions, you get away with it.
I get it. You want individual federal judges who hate Donald Trump.
No, I don't.
To tie him up for 4 years.
No, I don't.
If you want a big
Not at
policy
all.
questions decided, let the Supreme Court do it. But in the
And this is where it's frustrating. Why don't any of them flip that on Scott just as crudely, just as rudely? I get it, Scott. You want Republican presidents to be gods who get to do whatever the hell they want. But when a Democrat's in power, you want a Democrat-hating judge to smack down Democratic policies. You are the hypocrite here, and your hypocrisy is made worse by the fact that it endorses authoritarianism. Why? If Catherine Rampell were here, and I wish she were, she would have hit Scott Jennings back on this. But unfortunately, at least so far, his co-hosts treat him with kid gloves.
interim, the executive has to be allowed to
pray
govern.
tell, how do we get to the Supreme Court? Can
Just
somebody
appeal,
tell me?
and that's fine, but you can't tie 'em up
we get
until
to
it
the
gets
Supreme
there. You
Court.
can't tie 'em up
we
until
get to
it
the
gets
Supreme
there.
Court by the judge's ruling, things going to appeal, and then it goes.
And in the meantime, what happens? Trump can't act? Trump can't
In the
act?
meantime, you're supposed to comply with the court's rulings. Am I wrong about that?
Well, you're supposed to comply, but Scott's absolutely right in that the court cannot say you have to spend these dollars today. So as a governor, I dealt with this. We got things challenged in state court.
So this is former New Hampshire Governor Chris Sununu, who just left office back in January. He's a guy who endorsed Nikki Haley during the 2024 Republican primary because he had principled objections to Donald Trump. But then, of course, like most others, he bent the knee and put party above country. He's now a former governor. Again, note how he kind of undermined Scott correctly by saying, actually, no, you're right. You know, you are supposed to comply with orders. And remember, we did some videos on this yesterday. We have a judge confirming that the Trump administration is violating his court order, that the Trump administration is disobeying the court and violating this court order when they're supposed to comply. And Scott's argument, well, wait a minute. So, yeah, you can appeal to the court, but in the meantime, you're supposed to do what the court says. That's the understanding. And that was certainly the understanding when you all were challenging the Biden administration. You expected when a conservative court issued an injunction or a temporary restraining order or a pause, the Biden administration was obligated to comply as far as you're concerned, even while they appealed. But the standard is different for Republican presidents. Why aren't people calling Scott out for this?
Court and federal court. It's all judge shopped, by the way. Judges don't randomly get these cases. There's a reason that these cases are filed in Boston, the Boston court, or a certain
Island.
district, Rhode Island, because they know they're going to get a judge that
That's
is
a
politically
great
favorable.
bipartisan practice as well.
Yeah. Both sides do it. I mean, I think
How many times that district court and judge one guy in Texas shut down Joe Biden?
But you raised the right point.
That was that's Ellie Honig, who is kind of a centrist legal analyst that's employed by CNN. Again, I say he's pretty centrist, but that's a good point that he brings up. The judge shopping is bipartisan, and there is, I think it's Judge Kaczmarek, a Trump-appointed conservative judge out of Texas that conservatives and Republicans regularly went to because he would issue nationwide blocks. I think one was the mifepristone, pill ban that was issued nationwide. So again, Scott Jennings loves that. Chris Sununu loves that. That's okay. It's okay for conservative judges to do whatever they want, but not like liberal judges or like non-conservative judges. That's different. Or not even conservative judges when they happen to disagree, as they so often do, with Republican presidents. That's different.
Point. Should the president,
then the
the
Biden
singular
administration
president,
actually
should he have to
went
share
along
the
with what the
should
judge
he
said?
have to share the presidency with 300 district court judges? No, absolutely not.
But the point, though, you made a really good point that there have been judges that shut down some of President Biden's executive actions, and they understand, the Biden administration understood
And he ignored
the
it.
checks and balances.
The Supreme
But
Court
not-
tried to stop me,
not
but they
in
never will.
But
Who
not
said
in the way
that?
that Donald
Who said
Trump
that?
is.
Who said
not
that?
in the way that
Joe
Donald
Biden.
Yeah,
Joe
but
Biden.
Donald
but
Trump
Scott,
has-
he actually didn't ignore it.
He
That's
did.
right.
They continued to plow
No.
forward with
No,
student
he
aid. How
didn't.
much did
No,
they
no,
spend?
no.
Let me set the record
he
up.
He actually got dinged on the student loan
hated
debt
the
forgiveness.
student loan forgiveness policy.
What did he say
Hold
out
on.
loud?
I thought
What
it
did
was.
he say
I
out
thought it
loud?
was a ridiculous
didn't
policy.
ignore it.
I thought it was unconstitutional. I predicted it would get struck down. It did get struck down, and I
didn't
applauded.
ignore it.
He did not ignore it, though. He went and tried under a different law.
So he ignored
You're
it.
allowed. No,
That's not ignoring it.
it.
That
So
is
he was
trying
not
to
ignoring
make
it.
it
He's
work
trying to
under
do it.
law.
He's
He
trying to
really
do it.
defied it.
But let me just.
So again, this is where Scott, he's just outmatched. What he has in smugness, he lacks in credibility. He lacks in argumentation. He's just outmatched on the facts. Ellie Honig, who is an attorney, who, by the way, against centrist, Ellie Honig took a position on CNN that he opposed the Manhattan court cases against Donald Trump. So this is not a guy who's afraid to back Donald Trump. But he's like, listen, Joe Biden didn't defy the Supreme Court. And this is true. You will see conservatives, we've talked about it in recent videos, say, well, Joe Biden defied the Supreme Court. No, he didn't, dumbass. He didn't. When Joe Biden went forth with his initial student loan forgiveness program, it was challenged, by the way, paused, I believe, by a lower court federal judge. Scott Jennings didn't say shit about that. Then it was okay to stop something from the Biden administration. Then it's okay for lower court judges to overrule the president because the president's a Democrat. And then ultimately, the conservative Supreme Court struck down President Biden's student loan forgiveness program. Biden ended the program, which is why the people who were eligible under that program didn't get their student loan forgiveness. So Scott Jennings is objectively factually wrong. He will always lose the debate. We will always win because we're better on the facts. And then what Biden did is Biden consulted a different authority and created a more targeted student loan forgiveness program, which he had every right to do. And that is also being challenged in court. This idea that the Supreme Court did or could issue a blanket ban on any form of student loan forgiveness is bullshit. They can't do that. It's not what they did. They said, this particular thing you're trying to do, you can't do it. And Biden said, okay, well, I'm going to do this other thing, which is perfectly fair. But they're saying, oh, Biden defied the Supreme Court. No, that's how it works. The president doesn't have to go to the Supreme Court and say, hey, do I have your permission to do this? If the Supreme Court says, no, you can't do this, Biden says, I don't need your permission to do this other thing. I'm going to do it. And then if it gets to the Supreme Court and you strike it down, then we'll deal with it then. But again, the lies and dishonesty from these losers are just never ending. And he's arguing with an attorney over it. So pathetic.
I understand where you stand. If a district court judge rules in a way that the president dislikes, should the president listen or should the president defy?
If a district court judge tries to usurp the authority of the chief executive of this country, he should absolutely defy it. There's a difference between broad policy decisions and discrete disputes between parties. That's the difference. If I want a policy decided, I'll take it to the Supreme Court.
But what about checks and balances?
Well, Scott, you're
Of a district court judge who elected them.
What I can't get with is you talking in these bizarre, broad generalities.
It's not bizarre.
Every single one of these cases deals with a discrete issue, okay? It deals with funding. It deals with with certain constitutionally or statutorily appointed roles. Every single one of these things is a distinct thing, and they're all being dealt with by different judges. So it's not broad swaths of policy here. When the court says Congress, appropriated this money, you must unfreeze it while we litigate this. Why can't Trump comply with that?
So you're saying that a judge should decide how and when money is spent
a judge is saying,
for years, and not the president of the United
Scott,
States?
Let me explain.
No, the judge is saying that Congress has that power. Congress made the appropriation. Congress was the one who said you have to spend this money. It's not a judge arbitrarily saying you have to do it X, Y, and Z by this specific time. Again, Scott Jennings is a pathological liar, much like his cult leader, Donald Trump.
You're a governor,
a little bit more. Let me explain it a little bit more slowly. A judge is saying
you don't have to talk to me like that.
Congress.
I have a position on this, and you have an opinion. We can disagree.
Yeah, but I'm saying you listen to me because you're not listening, and you're making claims that are not connected to the facts. The judge is saying
maybe you are.
Congress appropriated a certain amount of money.
Yeah.
We need to litigate this.
Okay.
While we litigate this, we're going to put a hold on the actions that you took that might be unconstitutional.
So while we
That's
litigate,
part of the process.
this, I'm a judge and I'm in charge of the executive branch, and you're not. Forget it.
Yeah,
I totally
you just
disagree.
Can't compel the executive.
Again, unless a Democrat is president, then any judge, be it a lower court judge, a district judge, a court of appeals, like an appellate judge or the Supreme Court, then they're given license to do whatever the fuck they want with a Democratic president. Scott is so transparent here. And again, you can see Abby Phillip getting so fed up by his willful ignorance and his stubbornness and his hypocrisy.
Executive branch to spend the dollars. You can't do that. They can't say we're going to start. The
Have
judges
you
are going
heard
to start
of
writing
the
the checks. They have every
impoundment?
right to
Have you
hold
heard
that.
of the Impoundment Control Act of 1974?
No.
Okay, well, let me play this. Let me play
And by the
this.
way, none of your viewers have
Okay,
either.
well, I'm gonna
explain it in a
I'm gonna
sentence.
play this clip for you. This is in Congress. Russ Vought, who is the architect of a lot of this, was being questioned in Congress about the Impoundment Control Act, which actually says that the executive branch should spend the money how Congress appropriated it. Here's what he said is going on right now in the federal government.
Do you believe the Impoundment Control Act of 1974 is the law of the land that you must follow?
It is the law of the land. As you know, the president has run on that issue. He believes it's unconstitutional. For 200 years, presidents had the ability to spend less than an appropriation if they could do it for less. And we have seen the extent to which this law has contributed to waste, fraud, and abuse.
So, Ellie, this is the law of the land. They might be wanting to challenge it, but it is the law.
Right. The Impoundment Control Act says essentially the president cannot block money allocated by Congress. To the power of district court judges, and I understand your point, Scott. I understand the frustration people have when a district court judge blocks a broad mandate from the chief executive, the elected chief executive. Ultimately, the big issues go up to the Supreme Court. But I guess I would ask both of you, what if a district court judge had blocked Barack Obama's DACA plan, the Dreamers plan, right? And he said, heck with you, I'm doing it anyway. Would you be okay with that? Or would you have a problem with that?
No,
would that be okay?
So again, that's where we're forgetting a key.
Again, I love that, right? And Chris Sununu is not in a position to answer this credibly because he's just screwed. He's just objectively wrong. Leonig is right to say, listen, you're hypocrites on this. We know that you would be feeling very differently if the political affiliation of the president in question were different and you had a personal preference that is contrary to what you have now. And that's why Chris Sununu is stammering here. And the guest in between them is pointing this out. Like, yeah, there'd be a riot if the Obama administration disregarded a court order on something like DACA during the Obama administration.
Key piece of the third branch of government. That's where Congress steps in.
Yes.
Right? You have to remember that a judge can't just say, well, I'm going to arbitrarily block something. They say, I'm blocking it because of this, and Congress can step in and be more specific and more refined if they want to.
Well, how does that work with Congress, who's appropriated funds for all of these other agencies?
So it can't work that
way. And now the
Congress
executive branch is
$20
stepping
million
on Congress.
if Congress appropriates $20 million for a program, do you, as the chief executive, do I have to spend $20 million on that program?
Well, actually, this is
But
what
do
I'm
I?
trying to. This is why I
Because
brought.
if I don't, what's the number?
I know that
Why
the
not do a bit of an
Impoundment. Hold on,
investigation into it first?
I know that the
instead of-
Impoundment Control Act thing
executive.
sounds really wonky, but I guess the point I'm trying to make is that I understand the idea of testing laws. You want to see how far you can go, but the question that you are asking has been answered by the courts, okay? The reason that the Impoundment Control Act exists is to say that when Congress says we appropriate this money, it should be spent that way. That's their power. They have the power of the
Every state in the
purse.
country, when we pass a balanced budget, and I'll explain what a balanced budget is
Again,
to everyone
it's a
in Washington in a minute.
dispute, but I'm
we don't
saying
spend, this
that
called the
hasn't
lapse.
been proven
There's
in the
hundreds of millions of
courts.
dollars in New Hampshire that intentionally do not get spent on certain programs.
What
They're supposed to lapse
about
back into the
when the
system.
Trump administration says to Congress, you created this agency, we're going to just decide it doesn't exist anymore?
He runs the executive branch. He can decide who works for the executive
So
branch. He can decide
where
who
does
doesn't.
this end? So
It doesn't.
Congress creates an agency, the executive says, to heck with it. Congress appropriates money, the executive branch says, to heck with it. Where does this end?
So it ends. You can go back, and I like what they're doing, and they're going to whiteboard these programs out, and they're going to force each of these departments to come.
Nobody cares what you like, bro. Nobody cares what you prefer. She asked a good question. When does this end? You've effectively neutralized any check that Congress has against the executive. You have rendered Congress impotent by your own logic. No one cares what you prefer. That's a separate question. Where does it end? And he doesn't have an answer for it.
Come back and actually justify their existence, which no one in Washington has done for decades. If you want NIH money to go forward, explain to me why, how, and how it's going to be spent.
All right, so the next
That's all. They're
Democratic
going to
president
force
who
them to the
says
table.
ICE is going to just disappear, I expect that the two of you will say that sounds
I think all of America.
Kind of.
So there you have it. I mean, again, great point by Abby Phillip there at the end. Okay, the next time a Democrat is president and they decide to effectively neutralize just by executive fiat an agency or a body within the executive branch that you happen to like or support, we expect you to shut the hell up and say, I don't like it, but the president has absolutely every right to do it. Of course, they won't say that because they're hypocrites and liars. Watching Scott Jennings become increasingly fervent and manic and openly authoritarian, openly pissed as the conversation went on was truly a sight to behold. But he laid bare the vacuous nature of his arguments, his double standards, and once again shows that MAGA, their shamelessness is their superpower. They don't care. They will truly say one thing on Monday, say something else totally different on Wednesday when it's convenient for them. So we need to keep that in mind once we retake power, that it's not about persuading MAGA stooges like Scott Jennings to get on board and find a standard that works for all of us. There is no standard. They don't care. It's all about a specific outcome. And they will employ whatever standard is fit in the moment to achieve that outcome and discard at the moment it's inconvenient. Pretty pathetic. In the meantime, let me know what you think in the comments.